No, 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 no. The Conservative Party is the most pro-immigration political party this country has ever had. It's the same as Labour saying they're getting tough on immigration, right? So the Uniparty is gaslighting everybody in this country.
Yesterday, we found out that Gazans may be coming to the United Kingdom under the so-called Ukrainian refugee scheme. Do you think it's right that Gazans should have access to the UK under this scheme?
No, of course it's not. We shouldn't be taking any refugees from Gaza. We've already taken enough refugees from Hong Kong, Ukraine, and I view this like most British people, which is within the context of our extreme experiment with mass uncontrolled immigration, which has to come to an end. And I think you can see both legally and illegally, migration has been an incredible burden to the British people. It's costing us £5.5 billion at least a year just to try and control our borders. That's before you get to all of the other associated costs that are coming with the welfare state, housing, policing, schools, etc., etc. So the Gaza refugee program, which is clearly not a legitimate program, it's piggybacking on the back of the Ukraine scheme, is yet another example, I think, of our political class not really listening to the 75% of people in this country who are saying, just bring immigration down. I don't want more people coming into the country. And to be frank, I don't want more people coming into the country from culturally different, if not incompatible nations, where many of those people hold views that are not compatible, consistent with our way of life. And the surveys of Gazans shows this. I mean, we've got lots of surveys that show the vast majority of Gazans support Hamas. They're positive about Hamas. They have views that I don't think are consistent. And, ask yourself a question. We're now being asked to take refugees from Gaza. Why aren't neighbouring countries taking more refugees from Gaza? And there's a reason for that, which is that, generally speaking, they hold views and attitudes and sympathies for groups that I don't think really have any place in our modern civilised society.
Now, I know that on your Substack you've written extensively about some of the issues that these so-called refugees and, in some cases, illegal migrants have brought to Britain, in particular crime. And I remember reading one of those stories about an Afghani refugee who came here and murdered a young British lad. Are you concerned that perhaps some of these Gazans might be extremists? We know that Gaza is, frankly, full of people who support Hamas, who are sympathetic to a terrorist organisation. And if they came to Britain, this could cause problems both socially but also from a criminal perspective.
Yeah, so I see two main threats to the British people, and my starting point is always, how do we keep the British people and the English people safe and secure? And the first of those threats is what we might call internal. It's coming from people who we've already let into the country and we can't deport because of our membership of the European Convention on Human Rights and because our leaders refuse to reform things like the Human Rights Act and basically deal with that Blairite legislative legacy that underpins our system. And we've seen shocking cases, and I won't go through all of the cases, but the one that really sticks in my mind was the murder of Thomas Roberts, a young aspiring Marine who was killed by a guy who had come over from Afghanistan who said he was 14, but he was 19. He'd already killed two men in Europe, and there were lots of warnings about this guy, and Thomas Roberts went out with his mates one night and he didn't come home because this guy basically murdered him. And there were lots of other examples of that, and that guy should not have been in the country, and we couldn't deport him, much like we can't deport the Albanian drug dealers and the Iraqi criminals, because we're part of the ECHR. Now, I want to leave the ECHR. I think that's the right thing to do. I think it's the logical follow-on from Brexit to actually return us to being a sovereign, independent nation that's in full control of our borders and our laws. The internal threat, however, is not only coming from refugees from places like Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria. It's also coming, I think, from the fact that we have large numbers of people in this country who already sympathise with Hamas. I've looked at the surveys. I've written about the surveys that between 30 and 40% of British Muslims, for example, express very positive views of Hamas. They also express anti-Semitic tropes, believing, for example, that Jews have too much power. About 40% of British Muslims say they'd like to have their own political party in this country. And in fact, only this week we've seen the beginnings, arguably, of that with the new Independent Candidate Alliance, which is looking to mobilise Muslim candidates in places like Birmingham. That's sectarianism. That shouldn't be in our country. And then we have the external threats. And the external threats really coming from instability in other parts of the world, where you have people still actively trying to get into the UK on the small boats or, on lorries or whatever, illegally, and trying to add to what we've got in this country, which is about 1.2 million illegal migrants, according to the Pew Research Centre. So those are the two principal threats facing the British people. What I want to see is our country to begin to talk seriously about how we can actually deal meaningfully with those threats. And I have a very clear idea in my mind how I think we do that. But those are the things that are leaving the Brits saying, this is insane. I didn't vote for this. I don't want to support this. I don't want to pay for this. And I don't want my kids to suffer the consequences of this. Because just lastly, you mentioned crime. We've heard for 20 years from the expert class in this country that there's no relationship between immigration and crime. Now, what's fascinating about that, Stephen, is at the same time the state has been hiding information and data about criminality by ethnicity, nationality and immigration status. You just can't get the data. Now in Denmark you can. Germany now, you're starting to get it. France too, and it tells a pretty convincing story, which is people from outside of those nations are more prone to commit crime. Rob Bates at the Centre for Migration Control here in the UK has just done a Freedom of Information study where he submitted Freedom of Information requests to police authorities, and he finds exactly the same. He finds that foreign nationals in Britain are twice as likely to be arrested as British nationals and 3.5 times as likely to be arrested for sexual offences, for rape, sexual assault. So I think there is a relationship between immigration and the security of the British people. My starting point always is what keeps the British people, citizens, taxpayers, patriots safe and secure, and work back from that point. And I think that means dealing with these two threats.
It's fascinating reading on your Substack about the kind of data and the analysis of the views of individual migrants, and also, as you say, a breakdown of migrant crime. One of the things we saw recently was a judge deciding that an Albanian criminal can stay in the UK because their child was concerned about the quality of chicken nuggets in Albania. It just sounds extraordinary. I know you mentioned about leaving the ECHR, that's one of the solutions. To what extent do you think the problem lies on individual judges in these cases? Because perhaps they could have interpreted the law in a different way, which would have meant that he was deported in that specific case. And we've seen lots of other absurd cases, where you've got these judges who seem, frankly, to be very left-wing activist judges. So do you think that is a problem, or are they just simply interpreting the law as they see it?
Well, actually, the first thing to say is the case that you mentioned is even worse than you're suggesting, because the guy who was at the centre of that case was a paedophile who had assaulted, and I'm quoting directly, barely pubescent girls, 13, 14, 15 years of age. He was a paedophile, much like the men in the rape gangs. I say men, but much like the perpetrators in the rape gangs. And my view on that has always been clear. If you're a dual national, if you hold nationality, Britain, Pakistan, and you're convicted of sexual offences, you should be deported. If you're a foreign national, you should be deported. And we should use things like foreign aid, visa penalty programs and others to apply pressure on those countries to take those people back. But there's been another case recently of a lady from the Caribbean who overstayed her visa illegally. We then have struggled to deport her because she's used the human rights legislation to claim that her Latvian husband would find it too hot in the Caribbean and wouldn't like Caribbean food, and because of his right to human rights, she's been able to delay that deportation. On one level, you look at these stories in the papers and you shake your head, and some people even laugh. I think it's a morally unjust abuse of British taxpayers and our sense of fairness that these cases are happening, and they're rooted, I think, in two things. One is our membership of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is often used, the right to life, the right to right to a family life, is often used as a way of preventing deportation. So let's leave the ECHR, right? That's the first thing we need to do. Then we need to deal with a legal system, the judiciary, which has become activist in nature. So judicial review has spiraled since the 1990s, and judges, lawyers and others have basically become de facto political activists. So we need to deal, secondly, with with this massive judicial overreach within our own country. And the only way you can deal with that, I think, is by dealing with the underlying constitutional problem, which goes back to the Blairite laws, the Human Rights Act and the Equality Act. Now, if we were like Donald Trump and America, and you had a party with a massive majority that knew how to use power, then the priority for that movement in the first few months would be to dismantle the Blairite legacy that had been left over from 1997, 2001, 2005 from those governments. That's what Boris Johnson and the Conservatives should have done if they were Conservatives, but they're not. That fundamentally is what you need to do to roll back the activist legal system and to reassert the primacy of British laws and, more importantly, British people. And I think this also applies to the question of deportations, by the way, because I think this is really important. I fully support deporting illegal migrants and foreign national offenders from Britain. And what I mean by that is I want to start with the 150,000 who came illegally on the small boats. I want to then move to the 18,000 foreign national offenders who are in our communities. I then want to look at the 1.2 million who are here illegally, working, living in Britain, who shouldn't be here, according to the Pew Research Centre. Let's start working our way through those people, and let's start reasserting a sense of fairness, which is fundamentally central to our political culture and to our way of life, because that's what the British people deserve. They don't deserve to have a system that is basically incentivizing people, often from outside of Europe, to break our laws, and then for us to allow them to stay in the country. It's absolutely absurd.
Kemi Badenoch says that making a promise without a plan is pointless, and she doesn't, lay out her policy platform because she's waiting to formulate a proper plan to implement these policies. She was recently on a podcast and she was talking about perhaps we need to leave the ECHR if that's the correct solution. Do you trust Kemi Badenoch to solve the issue of immigration? Do you think she takes it seriously? Do you think she understands the problem or the threat that immigration poses to Britain?
No, I don't trust Kemi Badenoch, and I don't trust the Tories on immigration, and I never will, because like many other people watching this show, I lived through the last 14 years and I saw what the Conservative Parliamentary Party did to this country when it had the chance to do something radically different. The Conservatives betrayed their voters and they betrayed the country by promising lower overall numbers of migrants and reshaping our system to a high-skilled system. That's what they promised. What they gave us was an extreme policy of mass uncontrolled, low-skilled, low-wage migration, which we now know, according to the Office for Budget Responsibility, among other research centres, is taking more out of our national economy than it's putting in. We know this. The evidence is there. We know as well that the system the Tories put in place is absurd. They've said that that they welcome the best of the best. We know of the nearly 4 million people we gave visas to in recent years, 5.4% came in on high-skilled worker visas. That's 1 in 20. 5%. That's absurd. I'm furious about what they did to the country. We even got into this bizarro world where the dependency ratio for some of these groups, say people from Zimbabwe, we gave 1,000 visas to people from Zimbabwe to come and work in our health and social care system. They brought 10,000 relatives with them, 10 to 1. Now, you might say, well, what's the problem with that? Well, everybody's using housing, everybody's using the NHS, everybody's looking for GP appointments, everybody's using the roads. The point is, what this has basically resulted in, as even government reports now admit, is what they call, in technical language, the dilution of capital stock. What they mean by that is the managed decline of our country. So if you're looking around Britain and you're thinking, well, this is suddenly looking rather shabby and nothing seems to be working, that's because we've entered what is called a population trap, which is the rate of our population growth is so great, it exceeds the capacity of the state to provide public services. Why aren't my kids safe on the streets of Britain? Why is the NHS not working? Why are schools looking run down and terrible? Why can't we control the borders? Why is our economy flatlining? No growth, masses of debt, no productivity, because we're in a population trap. It's just nobody in Westminster wants to admit it. I mean, we were told, Stephen, for 20 years that if we just bought into mass immigration, we'd have a dynamic, flourishing economy. I remember Tony Blair, I'm old enough to remember Tony Blair saying this is going to lift all boats. And if you don't believe in globalization, which, remember, globalization is economic and cultural. It's about ripping open markets and ripping open countries. That's what globalization is. Blair said it would lift all boats. Turns out, actually, what it did is it smashed the working class in Western economies. It undermined national morale. It left us with sluggish, low-growth, high-debt economies, which, as we can see here, our GDP per capita is going backwards. We're not actually dynamic or growing, even though we're flooding this economy with bodies. And it was the Tories who basically doubled down on the extreme experiment that was begun by Tony Blair. So that's why I call them the Uniparty. They're exactly the same. There's no meaningful difference between them. And the problem with Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick, by the way, because I suspect Robert Jenrick will end up running for the leadership again, given how badly Kemi Badenoch is doing in the polls. The problem is they can promise the British people, yeah, we'll leave the ECHR, yeah, we'll slash immigration, yeah, we'll extend indefinite leave to remain, yeah, we'll do all these things. Everybody watching this show needs to know they won't do those things. Why? Because they're operating within the Conservative Parliamentary Party. Well, why does that matter? Because the Conservative Parliamentary Party is dominated by One Nation Liberals. It's basically the Liberal Democrats with another label. I'm talking about Oxbridge, educated, living in big cities, university towns, socially liberal, if not radically woke progressive, right? They're never going to let the Tory party leave the ECHR. They're never going to let the Tory party slash immigration. They're never going to let the Tory party actually prioritise the British people above supranational institutions and international quangos and organisations, because they're the Tory party, right? They are so consumed with social status, how they look at the dinner parties, how they look in London, Oxford and Cambridge. They're not actually interested in the people out there who I call the forgotten majority, who are basically completely fed up with this. And if you want a real symbol of why I don't believe the Tory party will ever fix this problem, Priti Patel. Priti Patel is back on the front bench, and shadow minister. This is the woman who presided over the wholesale liberalisation of the immigration system, and then turns around only a few weeks ago and says, yeah, well, I'll do it again.
Well, that's the question I want. The next question, you predicted it. Priti Patel, she's meant to be a hardliner, right-wing Tory MP.
No. The Conservative Party is the most pro-immigration political party this country has ever had, right? And everybody out there knows that. It's the same as Labour saying they're getting tough on immigration, right? So the Uniparty is gaslighting everybody in this country. Labour's not getting tough on the boats, it's not getting tough on the borders. What it's doing is it's decriminalising illegal migration. It's saying, oh, we're throwing out, 16,000 people. Well, most of them are going voluntarily. At the same time, Labour's removing the active deterrent in Rwanda. It's keeping benefits in place for illegal migrants. It's removing age checks. It's expanding migration from Afghanistan. It's basically making it easier to arrive in this country on small boats. It's giving incentives, not deterrents, for people to come, but they're gaslighting everybody out there by saying they're getting tough on it. The Tories, meanwhile, are gaslighting everybody by saying, yeah, we're going to lower immigration, knowing full well, this is what I would say to Kemi Badenoch, you know full well you're surrounded by colleagues who are fully invested in maintaining the status quo. This is the party that gave Britain everything you see around you today, right? So imagine inviting an architect into your house and saying, yeah, I'd like to do a bit of a renovation, and the architect destroys your house. You wouldn't invite the architect back. So why the hell would you invite the Tories back? Doesn't make any sense to me at all. That is why Kemi Badenoch and the Tories are on 18-19% in the national polls, because people are not idiots. The British people can see structurally this party is fully invested in the status quo, which has sold this country down the river.
Priti Patel was defending the so-called Boris wave of migrants. That's the huge wave of immigrants who came in under Boris Johnson and Priti Patel when she was Home Secretary. She said this was the best and the brightest. She said this was a points-based system where you get the high-skilled migrants coming in. And she also mentioned the Ukrainian refugees who came in and the British nationals overseas in Hong Kong and so on. So the defence of that Boris wave, the defence of the last 14 years, I'm going to put it to you, was these were the best and brightest, in Priti Patel's words, and we had to do it morally because we had to help Ukraine and we had to help Hong Kong.
So the first thing I would say this is my personal views, I have no issue at all with looking at people in Hong Kong who are being persecuted by China, looking at some people in Ukraine and saying, okay, for a limited period of time, we need to do what Britain has done historically, which is help some refugees. Where I draw the line is with this, and we need to be clear, with this extreme policy of mass uncontrolled, low-skilled, low-wage migration, 86% of which is coming from outside of Europe. I have no time for that. What I want to see, maximum, is an immigration system that delivers somewhere maybe around 50 to 75,000 net migration, where we were basically when Blair came into office in 97, which is high skill, which is from culturally compatible nations. By that I mean the Anglosphere, Europe, Canada, America, Australia, New Zealand. And I want to see all of the money we're wasting on mass immigration now, and I'll come back to the numbers in a second, invested in the British people. And by that I mean, I want British kids going to medical schools. I don't want us importing substandard doctors from other parts of the world. I want British people being paid properly to work in social care. I don't want the system using mass immigration to avoid reform. I want global corporations to be encouraged to hire British kids and British workers and get the millions of people that we've got in the welfare system back into work so they have a sense of meaning and dignity in their lives. I don't want mass immigration to be used by an alliance of the politicians in Westminster, global corporate CEOs and virtue signalers to make them all feel better, to keep their profits high, but then screw over the British people, because that's exactly what's happening. And the numbers are bananas, right? So here's what most people watching this show don't know. If you take the millions of people who came in under Boris Johnson and Priti Patel, millions of people, the fastest population growth we've had on record, and by the way, that's going to continue. Even the government's own forecasts show we're going to have another 10 million people by 2047. That's basically another London in the next 22 years. That's insane. You know, we can't even provide housing for people now. Can't even have a functioning NHS now. If all of those people that came in under Boris Johnson and Priti Patel, once they stay here for 5 years, they're going to get something called indefinite leave to remain. What does that mean? It means they're going to get access to NHS, schools, university loans, benefits. After another year, citizenship. They can bring in more relatives, they can get the same, and it becomes an ongoing cycle. Now, we know most of the people who are already here are low skill, low wage, right? So they're working as delivery drivers, Just Eat drivers. They're basically international students that come for a year, do an MA program, flip over into a low skill, low wage job, and the British taxpayers watching this end up picking up the tab because they're not actually driving our economy. They're just kind of dependent upon taking more out of the economy than they're putting in. So we know they're already costing us. But when then you get indefinite leave to remain and those costs go forward decades, according to the Centre for Policy Studies only this week, what that's going to give the British taxpayers watching this show is a bill of £234 billion. £234 billion, right? Which is utterly insane. It's an avoidable bill. Yvette Cooper could stop this today, right? She could do what Charles Clarke did in the 2000s, and she could say, you know what? Really difficult time, COVID pandemic, you know, NHS falling apart, you know, British kids, you know, struggling, poverty is going up, unemployment starting to go up, we've got too many people on the welfare system. Let's extend this indefinite leave to remain to 15, 20 years, or even better. Let's say to people who want to apply for indefinite leave to remain, let's not just extend the period, which I would agree with, but let's say, okay, you've got to give us 10 to 15 years of tax returns so we can see whether or not you've made a contribution to the country. That's another thing we could do. If you're a criminal, if you've got a criminal record, you should never be allowed to stay in this country. If you've been on benefits, you should never be allowed to stay in this country. If you've lived in social housing as well. These are things that we should be doing to ring fence what I would argue needs to be installed in our country, which is a principle of national preference, which is in every sector, housing, the economy, public services. We have a simple test, which is current policy prioritising hard-working, tax-paying British people and their kids? That's the principle that should run through everything. So I'm not a universalist. I don't believe all cultures are equal. I don't believe that we should be falling over ourselves to spend money on climate change initiatives in, you know, Indonesia while we're smashing British family farms here on these islands. I genuinely think policy needs to now be directed by a principle of national preference. So the numbers are bananas, and they're going to get even worse because of the legacy of not just the Tories, but what New Labour started before. And that's the important point. Everybody out there needs to know you're not looking at two different parties. You're looking at a uniparty that is unified in promoting the same elite consensus that has been imposed on British people in this country for the last 30 years, which is mass immigration, rampant globalisation, woke ideology, London-centric economy, obsession with foreign aid, £15.3 billion we give to other people around the world, and we are literally treating British people in hospital corridors and car parks. It is obscene. It is absolutely outrageous, and I think the British people have had enough of it.
And £18 billion potentially for Mauritius, for the Chagos Islands, which seems extraordinary. Kemi Badenoch said in the same interview on this podcast that if you shut down all visas from Pakistan, that would be a problem because you wouldn't get some of the best and brightest people from Pakistan that Britain needs in our economy. You talk about differentiating different cultures and nations and so on, and discriminating in that way in terms of who we let into the country. Do you agree with Kemi on that point about, we can't stop people coming from Pakistan because we might be losing out on some of the best people who may come to Britain?
So the first thing to say is I don't think we should be giving Pakistan £133 million this year on foreign aid, just as a start. And I think we need to dramatically reduce the amount that we're spending on foreign aid. My I don't want to say motto because it's too flippant, because it's a belief. We should fix Britain first before helping the world, right? That is my default framework of how I see where we are. So 18 billion for Mauritius, 133 million for Pakistan, 250 million for Ukraine. The numbers just absolutely become mind-boggling, right? 234 billion on immigration costs. Where I depart from much of the Uniparty is that I believe that the primary crisis we are facing today, the main crisis that we are facing, is actually not transactional. It's not about policy. It's not a cold cost-benefit analysis. I believe the crisis we are facing is civilizational, in that I believe the question of who are we is going to be the dominant question for the next few decades. And the answer to that question, I believe, is that we are a distinctive country, a nation with a distinctive identity, history, culture, way of life, that is rapidly being eroded, if not in some areas of our national life is being destroyed by a political class, by a ruling class that no longer believes in who we are. That's my general view. So when it comes to issues like immigration, and should we have immigration from Gaza, Pakistan, Nigeria, China, Vietnam, I am now working from the position of I want to really start with the question of what is going to help us maintain all of the things that make us a distinctive national community. Migration will need to be coming, if we need any migration, will need to be coming from culturally compatible, similar nations to our own. By that I mean people who believe in the West, who believe in our values, believe in our ways of life. Our education system needs to be reshaped, so we are not teaching our kids, as we saw this week with Gen Z believing that Britain is a racist country and they're ashamed of calling themselves British. Well, that's just a reflection of what I've seen in 20 years of teaching in the universities, which is we have an education system that is fully invested in undermining that sense of collective identity. We have a cultural arena with museums, galleries, publishing houses and others who are similarly invested in undermining the collective sense of us being an us, of us having a shared sense of identity. And wherever you look in British society, this attack on who we are, I think, is becoming increasingly visible, or what Roger Scruton once called the culture of repudiation, that the elite class has radicalized to such an extent, it now derives status by repudiating who we are, by basically saying, I'm proud to call Britain a racist nation, or if I'm David Lammy, I'm going to open up negotiations over reparations, right, which is like idiocy. but that's what they want to do because they don't really believe in who we are and they have a fundamentally negative view and they want to repudiate who we are. Most British people don't think like that. Most British people out there are very proud. Most English people are very proud of these islands, of their ancestors and what has been contributed over generations and what we've built up over generations, and that's given us this remarkable culture. And cultures generate prosperous nations. It's not, markets don't generate cultures. Cultures generate economic prosperity, which is why so many people want to come here. Because not all cultures are equal, because even people in Somalia and Nigeria and China and Zimbabwe can acknowledge that our culture is superior. That's why they want to come, because they recognise that our culture generates prosperity and our culture provides a better way of life. But we need to maintain that culture and protect that culture, and that's how I filter through these issues and questions around migration, migration and demography.
And just to end the interview, I want to ask a bit about polling. Keir Starmer's been Prime Minister for more than 7 months now. It looks like he's pretty unpopular. Can you break down some of the numbers there and also discuss perhaps Reform's numbers in the polls? It looks like they're doing well. Can you talk about perhaps their ceiling? I know a lot of people think they have a ceiling of around 32% or something. Could they rise above that?
Well, the first thing, what I would say is we are living through the realignment of British politics, which has been underway for about 15 years. And it started, the first sign of it was Nigel Farage and UKIP. The next big sign was the vote for Brexit. Then the Brexit Party, then Boris Johnson's big election victory in 2019, including taking the Red Wall. The Tories then showed they were unable to lean into that realignment. Donald Trump continued to lean into it. That's why he did really well last year. And now Reform are becoming the main beneficiary. They're inheriting the realignment that the Tories proved unable to remain connected to. So that is how I view the longer term story. Now, within that, Labour's Loveless landslide last year, where yes, it won a big majority, but on the lowest share of the national vote for decades for any winning a new governing party, it helps to explain why Labour has become so unpopular so quickly, because there was never a strong mandate to begin with. So as we talk today, Labour is down more than 10 points on what it polled at the election last year. Only 16% of Brits out there approve of Keir Starmer's government, according to YouGov. His personal ratings are minus 35, which is basically where Prince Andrew is in the royal favourability tracker. And more fundamentally, Labour clearly doesn't know what it wants to do with power, right? As reflected in things like the Sue Gray shambles, as reflected in the policy priorities of the government. It has no serious answers to the questions of how do you generate growth? How do you fix the borders? How do you lower migration? How do you improve living standards? How do you generate prosperity? Labour has no meaningful answers to those questions. Clearly, we can all see that. So that's why Labour is very unpopular. Reform, obviously I'm sympathetic to Reform. I speak at the conferences and events. But what's fascinating to me about Reform is not only is Nigel Farage and the party continuing to eat into the Conservative electorate. It's currently winning over 1 in 4 people who voted Tory in 2024, and it has already won over 1 in 4 who voted for Boris Johnson in 2019. So it's really becoming a problem for Kemi Badenoch and the Tories. It's also winning over a really big chunk of disillusioned Labour and Lib Dem voters and lots of none of the above non-voters. So that's where you get the Reform electorate. Reform needs to poll about 32% to win a majority, right? Depending on what kind of model you're running. Now, they're averaging, as you and I are speaking now, in mid-February 2025, they're averaging around 26%, not far off. People used to say Farage had a ceiling, right? That he was a toxic, polarising politician, and yes, he can win European elections, but he can't win general elections. I actually don't think that's true now, because I think such is the disgust with the Uniparty, such is the frustration, such is the awareness that nobody on the established left and right have the answers to the problems that the British people want fixed. Such is a disillusionment out there that I think while Nigel Farage is winning over the people who like Nigel Farage, I think he's now beginning to win over people who look at him and say, actually, I don't think Nigel has all the answers, and I don't think Reform has all the answers, but they look a bit closer than this Uniparty. And I think actually what this system needs is radical wholesale change. And I think that's the guy that's probably going to help do it. Now, can he get a good team around him? Can he get a good party structure around him? Can he get well organised, highly active branches in the right parts of the country, down the east coast of England, into the Red Wall, across Wales? If he can do all of those things, and he can learn the lessons from Trump's campaigning in America, and he can acknowledge, this is what I think is a crucial point, that there is a generation coming up behind him who are just as desperately concerned about the state of this country as he is, and he can open the gates to those people, and he can start to get a team together, then I really do think anything is possible in this country when you have 75% of people saying, I want immigration lowered, when you have 70% of people saying Britain's going in the wrong direction. You know, the apathy and the anger out there. Like, I speak at events every week. I mean, it is palpable. People are furious at what's happening. They're furious at Keir Starmer. And Kemi Badenoch, she's not even in the conversation. The Tories aren't even in the conversation. The brand is broken. People have just completely checked out. So that gives, I think, Reform the biggest opportunity any anti-establishment party has ever had in this country, I think, since the rise of the Labour Party in the early 20th century.